The characters in Tip Toland's sculptures are fragile creatures that find themselves at the end of adulthood or at the beginning of childhood. Those stages in life have a certain vulnerability, isolation, and innocence in common. Toland attempts to demonstrate the decline preceding death and the increased separation from others it brings. Their expressions are unengaged and convey a sense of deep psychological detachment that is sad and enigmatic, as well as dignified by the process of natural aging. While exploring age and aging, Toland's work attempts to give voice to inner psychological and spiritual states of being. What is of primary importance to her is that the figures contain particular aspects of humanity, which they mirror back to the viewer. It's the fragility and transient aspect of mankind that the artist is after. That is one reason for choosing very old or very young subjects. They both portray innocence as well as complexity. While her subjects are sometimes self-portraits, they are meant to convey universal truths about humanity, society, and the self. And these pieces are made from clay, however, they are not always finished with traditional ceramic materials such as glaze. She does build up layers with glaze and with washes and underglazes, but sometimes she also works on these with house paint and adds mixed materials as well. Inspired by 18th century porcelain figurines, Chrysanthemum's work employs a unity of design and concept to simultaneously examine and parody male and female relationship roles. Characters, themes, and incidents build upon each other, effectively forming their own language that speaks about domestic rights, social etiquette, and taboos. Themes from the classics and the romantics are given a contemporary edge. Elaborate dinner parties, picnic luncheons, and ornamental gardens set the stage for her twisted tales to unfold. These are two of her smaller pieces. Most of her pieces don't get larger than about 18 inches to 2 feet. These are a little on the smaller size of those with much simpler dioramas rather than ones with a multitude of figures. Crystal Moret explores the relationship between humans and nature with her intriguing ceramic sculptures of people encased in animals. Using delicate and emotive gesture, rich texture, and subdued tones, Moret carefully molds the figurative sculptures from clay, creating pieces that are both striking and thought-provoking. Notice how neutral in tone these are. They aren't meant to shock or anything like that. They're meant to be sort of subtle merging of these two figures. The role that the hand plays in keeping tradition alive is a common thread in relaying this information from generation to generation. The use of the figure to represent these narratives is a natural step for Geoffrey Synge. Through manipulation of body language, surface, and environment, he captures the emotions tied to these stories. Using inspiration from folklore, music, and folk art, the pursuit of happiness and traveling allows him to create constructed realities that blend both a cultural view and his own perceptions of these myths and traditions. This is achieved by creating installations made of smaller-than-life quilted ceramic figures and animals, reclaimed wood structures, found objects, and projected images. Paddy Warashina's variety of themes, human condition, feminism, car culture, social, political topics, and insider art issues are used throughout her works. Prominent in her work is Warashina's sense of humor. Be it a visual spoof on contemporary concerns or satirical commentary, her cleverly worded titles emphasize her personal perspective. Yamada's sculptures seek figurative extensions of shared experiences. The vocabulary of clay consists of gestures, patterns, textures, colors, and rhythms, which often mirror human existence. In conversation, these qualities bring the figure to life. With clay, he looks for sculptural conversations that evoke the beauty, the subtleties, the sadness, and the humor of our everyday life. He hopes for people to enjoy the moment rather than the movement of time. Yamada aims for his work to fill the space between two seemingly distant things, to provide a connection and thus create a story of the artist to the viewer. His pieces are very much slice-of-life moments. They reflect on relationships and human relationships to each other within a family or outside of a family, so that they're able to be understood more universally rather than just as his personal story. Although Cordova's work is tightly realist in nature, it's also profoundly conceptual. She has said she wants to make figures that navigate the territory between the sensorial experience of an object and the psychological nature of our involuntary dialogues with the self-referential. She provides the screen, and the viewers project their own responses onto it. She uses the figure as a vehicle for broad concerns and representations, creating an intangible atmosphere that surrounds her figures and tableau like a bubble. Her figures have nothing to do with a specific person. They are not portraits. Their faces, bodies, and poses are universal and often duplicated. The work is not subtle. It tends to be very dramatically confrontational. And the psychological status of her figures proclaim itself to the viewer via theatrical positioning of the bodies. Akio Takamori's work is often autobiographical, drawing on his life in Japan, his family, and mythological themes. He is known for his coil-built figurative sculptures in which the narrative painting defined the form. Takamori explored themes of cultural identity by engaging the history of Eastern and Western aesthetics. Both form and color defines his body of work, which is highly expressive of human emotion and sensuality. Preoccupied with figuration, Grove's practice stems from a keen interest in historical forms and a desire to ask new questions and raise fresh perspectives on contemporary figurative ceramic practices. Collectively, these sculptures bear witness to his artistic journey. Singularly, they do not represent or illustrate any one particular moment or entity. Rather, they interweave many significant milieux, associations, and obsessions. For example, the piece on the right, is this depicting something that actually happened, or is it an exaggeration? Like, what is this object over the figure? Is it armor? Is it a cage? Is it a disguise? What is this thing? Whilst the work incorporates recognizable components which have universal appeal, it is Grove's intention that the meaning of the work can never be described or interpreted in any strict or absolute terms, and should be dependent upon the viewer's own poetic imaginings. You can probably find direct connections to what you think these pieces might be stories to, such as the piece on the left. Where do you think that comes? Does it maybe reflect on tales of Bigfoot or other mythological creatures? And what era would you think the figure on the right would fit with? The ceramic sculpture of Sunkuyu is composed of tight groupings of various forms, including plants, animals, fish, and human figures. While Korean art and Buddhist and Confucian beliefs inform some aspects of his imagery, his work is largely driven by implied narratives that often suggest socio-political critiques. His ceramic sculpture expresses not only physical realities, but psychological realities at the same time. The sculpture also reflects his relationships with people and life experience, encompassing front and back, inside and outside, present and past memories. Kevin Snipes' work is based in the combination of narrative imagery on hand-built ceramic forms, but he primarily thinks of himself as a storyteller. The stories he tells are open-ended investigations of differences and otherness. They're ways in which to explore the underlying emotional and psychological issues of discrimination. He is interested in what happens when people who are different come together. One aspect of his work is that the narratives portrayed encompass different sides, so that every side of the piece is the front side, or protagonist. This said, his approach to working with these ideas is somewhat subversive. Both the intimate scale and the jewel-like surfaces that are hallmarks of the work are a sort of misdirection that the viewer must dig through to get to the kernel of the work. He works this way because he believes that the viewers are dynamically engaged enough to understand that there is a layer of social unease below the surface. And these works are not actually very large. Most of these pieces range around 6 to maybe 12 inches tall at the most. They are very small in scale. Sergei Isupov creates sculptures combining human and animal elements. Isupov depicts dreamlike, surreal narratives, most often illustrating self-portraits and autobiographical motives. Isupov constructs his porcelain and stoneware sculptures using traditional hand-building and sculptural techniques. The tattoo-like drawings that cover the surfaces of his work sometimes turn into three-dimensional elements, as a head, hand, or leg grows out of the piece. He uses stains and glazes to create colorful sections that work in contrast to the areas of black and white drawings. He also uses a great deal of underglaze with these pieces. Matt Weddell's work is based in ideas of landscape, culture, and mythology. It is about understanding our world, our history, and our path forward. It is about becoming, about existing, about finding hope. He is interested in learning from his work. It is a kind of making to find understanding rather than the work as a product of understanding. He feels like the work tells him more of what he does not know rather than what he does know. His glazes range from bright, singular colors to simulated metallics to multi-layered, dripping, very convoluted surfaces. So he works with glaze in a variety of ways, and it really does change your perception on these. If these were not quite so bright, would you respond the same way to them as if they were neutral colored? Weddell works on multiple pieces at one time. When one is at a point where he has to wait for it to be ready to continue working on it, he works on other pieces. This is an image of Weddell working in a studio with in-progress work. Now, if you look back at the other image, would you think that those pieces are at this scale? His pieces are larger than life at all times. Like, very rarely does he work on a small piece. And they can hit as much as 7 to 8 feet tall. They have to be fired in a specially designed kiln because it has to be of a certain size, and these pieces are hundreds and hundreds of pounds, and actually have to be either lifted with a crane or forklifted into a kiln. And they are, of course, very thick, so the firings can last multiple days. In Biljana Popova's work, she predominantly explores the female form, expressing artistic ideas through the silent body language of the figures she creates. With her larger sculptures to have structural integrity and to withstand the firing process, hollow forms are assembled. By the limitations of this method, these pieces tend to appear more static. The smaller figurines, however, are sculpted solid and then hollowed out in preparation for firing, and they're hollowed out as much as necessary while other components remain solid. The latter process allows for a great deal more freedom for working with the form, and they are more flowing and less static. These works are very minimalistic and graphical, reflecting her background in printmaking. Magdalene Glussek's work talks about sort of personal narratives, but not necessarily direct stories. The way in which we cultivate our visual self-representations tells a narrative that is sometimes louder than and often in conflict with what we might say about ourselves if prompted verbally to tell our story. These constructions are the types of narrations that she is most drawn to expressing in her sculpture. They unwittingly reveal aspects of her personalities that we might not always be aware of or prepared to share. Sometimes these stories are very individual expressions, at other times they reflect the narrative of our collective culture, and they alternate between performance and truth. Cynthia Constantino's work utilizes the figure along with references to familiar literary and visual symbols to delve into our collective experience and explore influences. We are constantly ingesting stories and images. Embedded within these are value systems and designations of what is normal and abnormal, good or bad. And over time, these stories all sort of assimilate together. The work on the right is highly identifiable on the story. I don't know if any of you remember at this point Popeye, the sailor, in cartoons and comics, but that is the story readily identifiable as, or the figure is readily identifiable as Popeye, and Olive is in the boat. I could no longer find the artist information though on this particular piece, but they tend to work with specific narrative stories that exist in society.